Welcome back to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. I'm your host, Ann Snyder, and as promised last Thursday, today's episode is a kind of sequel, if separate conversation about the challenges facing institutions and their leaders in a season of heightened conflict. Where last week I spoke with my own colleagues at Cardis, Ray Pennings and Brian Dykema, about some of our own institutional navigation of competing pressures, particularly as they are emanating out of the present conflict in the Middle East. Today, I want to talk about the pathways of formation required to cultivate the kind of wisdom, forbearance, and moral imagination needed for a very real world of constraints and differences. With me to reflect on this formation work today are David Katibah and Sarah Sturm, who together serve Telos, an organization that equips civic leaders to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflicts at home and abroad. David and Sarah, thank you for joining the Whole Person Revolution today.
It's our pleasure.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful invitation. Grateful to be here.
So in many ways, I think of Telos, the organization you both serve, as being born for this kind of moment in our world, especially given that I understand Telos was founded with specific reference to the very long-standing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But it's also been my sense that precisely the kind of historical moment an organization like Telos is born to rise up and lead within has been excruciatingly challenging. Is that observation or gut instinct true? And if it is, I'd just be very interested to hear you both expound on kind of the precise nature of how difficult the last number of months, especially since October 7th, have been.
Well, Telos is now 15 years old. And we were formed out of this experience or set of experiences that our co-founders, Todd Dethridge and Greg Khalil, had on the ground in the region. And importantly, they come from very different backgrounds. Todd worked in Republican politics for many years in the State Department and on the Hill. He's from Arkansas, comes from the evangelical tradition. Our other co-founder, Greg Khalil, is Palestinian American, grew up on the West Coast. His family is Palestinian Orthodox Christian, and very progressive. And they met on the ground, actually in the West Bank in Ramallah. And Greg began to give Todd this experience where, in a new way, he encountered the stories of people on the ground whose stories he had never heard before. And he was challenged by that. And he recognized that there was an opportunity to do the same thing that Greg had done for him, for folks from his community, to be opened and transformed through the encounters with real people who are facing what is now almost a 100-year-long conflict, who are not only suffering, but remaining steadfast with a vision of freedom and justice and reconciliation in this land. And it's a vision that they both shared, that they recognized that it's one that has to be not just freedom and justice for one people, but freedom and justice and security and dignity for all people. And that these binaries that we find ourselves often trapped in here in the US, which say that to be for one people, we must be necessarily against another people, that there is somehow this zero-sum game that we live in, is actually a lie. It's actually not true. In fact, that if we are going to move forward to invest in a world of peace, to build a world of healing and reconciliation, we have to believe in the possibility of abundance, of mutuality, that in fact we actually need each other to survive. We need each other to thrive. And so they built this organization to help seed this kind of new imagination for us in our world, because we have imported the conflict into our own politics. All of us are feeling that so acutely today. You know, if you're not on one side and vehemently, against the other critical of them in every which way, see them as the enemy, you're not a true believer, quote unquote, whatever that means in your situation. And we want to help build something new that says actually to be for one people requires you to be for all people in the region. Historically, this sounded like this tagline that we use that we call pro-Israeli, pro-Palestinian, pro-peace, that we're actually have to do all of those things simultaneously to do any of them. In this moment, that's an incredibly difficult mission to hold to. It's one in which we've faced significant pushback, significant misunderstanding, but we feel that it's the imagination our world needs, and that despite people, mentioning that this is a naive position to hold, it's actually we believe even a realist approach, that these binary camps that we found ourselves in have contributed to this very moment, that they brought us to this very moment. And so we need something new.
I want to add to what David's saying and add that we intentionally work with American communities of peacemakers. So while we at Telos take our lead from our Israeli and Palestinian colleagues and partners on the ground, one thing that makes us unique is we're Americans, predominantly in our US team, inviting our fellow Americans into this new way of engaging that does challenge these binaries of us versus them, or being for one side and against another side. When we open up this liminal space, or this third way space, we're able to form a movement of Americans who genuinely care about the flourishing of Israelis and Palestinians, and are able to step into a new way of engaging across lines of difference in this intentionally multi-faith, intentionally multi-partisan coalition or community that then invites their own, increasingly polarized communities into this way of engaging.
In your experience now working with Telos and a whole variety of aspiring American peacemakers, do you all find that this sort of binary zero-sum knee-jerk frame that you each named is both a particularly American, historically kind of American mental module, as opposed to, say, other cultures and countries? And or is it frankly something that is, I don't know, Gen X and above? Because I think there's something generational going on here too, in terms of what people think is possible. I'm just curious how you'd reflect on kind of the structure of the imagination, what you might call, frankly, even like a Cold War imagination. Is it specifically American, and is it, say, Boomer, Gen X-ish? And there's a younger crowd that is seeing it feel a little bankrupt.
I think that's a really important conversation. I mean, I can name for myself and Sarah, we come from kind of a late millennial, perhaps cusp Gen Z generation. And in my own personal experience, my generation is really questioning the efficacy of the strategies we've employed, not only in Israel Palestine, but in our own communities. And we have grown up in an increasingly and intensely polarized society, right? And it's not only tearing us apart communally, but even internally. There's this sense that it's dangerous to take position out in the world for the fear of losing any space to belong, especially when that position contradicts our own communities, right? And I think there's this growing sense in which we want something new. I mean, interestingly, prior to October, and I haven't seen a lot of polling since then, but younger Christians, primarily those from evangelical communities and backgrounds, were moving rapidly in their perspectives on Israel-Palestine specifically over many years, polling between 2015 and 2018 and around 2021 showed massive shifts. Something like half of younger evangelicals moved from being, quote, pro-Israel into a kind of both and position. And that was a move that was much faster than those who come from communities that aren't part of religious communities, or, I guess, non-Christian in this sense. So I think there is definitely a generational question going on right now. At the same time, I think these forces that within our society are forming us to be moved exclusively by our fear and by our anger continue to exacerbate these tensions and continue to shape our imagination to believe that the only way to move forward is to do so in a world in which my enemy cannot live and cannot flourish alongside me. And so we're seeing that even amongst young people, I would say, in our society, this sense of, exclusionary movements for justice, which is, increasingly such a commitment of younger generations. But it's one that I would say needs the invitation to imagine a world which even enemies can flourish together, side by side. That to create real systemic and lasting social change, we actually need to build inclusive movements. Real lasting change only happens when you build coalition across lines of difference. We saw this, a historical example that really paints this picture is in the anti-lynching movement in the early 20th century. You had, especially Black communities really rallying and trying to get buy-in, but in the meantime, you had folks like Ida B. Wells who were actively campaigning amongst white Southern women to help end the racial terror lynchings in the South. And it was part of those coalitions, even as they disagreed on other issues, that helped build an end to the practice of lynching in these communities. So I think there's an invitation for folks in our generation to imagine that kind of inclusive movement. As far as where this lands, from a geographical and cultural lens, I think that's a tough question to answer. I mean, in a lot of ways, we are trying to do this work amongst American communities, knowing that Americans specifically have a significant sense of agency on what happens in Israel-Palestine, recognizing that really what we need to move forward is not for America to have more of its hands mixed in here, but in fact, just to transform the way it's already involved. And then frankly, in some ways to get out, right? And that we contract the space for peace between Israelis and Palestinians rather than expand it. But ultimately that work does have to happen between Israelis and Palestinians, a kind of move towards justice and negotiation and ultimately reconciliation alongside it. And right now, the possibility for that is really, really small. This kind of sense of, I don't know if I can live alongside these people who are my neighbors is very deep in both communities right now. So I don't know if I would say, at least at this moment, it feels distinctly American, but it's definitely a massive challenge for our communities.
I'm glad David mentioned fear. That's the piece I wanted to pull out and bring up. And I think fear more than anything is what drives binaries and drives a scarcity mindset, but it's real and experienced. And I think each generation has had a different flavor of that or version of that. For one generation, the binary of the Cold War fed into that fear. For my generation, the kind of, young around 9/11, post 9/11 generation, it was a different kind of fear. For today's youth, the toxic polarization and, not idle conversation around civil war, right? Like that stokes a different kind of fear. And I think that those narratives, when those are felt and experienced by people, immediately puts people in a protectionist mindset. And that protectionism, right? How do I protect myself, my family, my tribe, my community, forces us to drive lines between us and them in a way that absolutely undercuts, right, the deeper work that we're called to. And I think a lot of what David just described, I would label as moral imagination. I think it's really important to remember that in every generation, there have been those visionaries. There have been those people who have morally imagined, right, cast that vision for what the world we want to see looks like. And that's such an important concept for me because, Telos often gets told we're naive or idealistic. But until we can imagine the kind of world we want to see and bring about, we have no hope of actually orienting our actions towards getting there. And I think, for each subsequent generation, for the youth of today, leaning into those people who have been casting that vision in the past, picking up where they left off, taking inspiration from that, recognizing that there are, right, always forces that divide, but there have always consistently been folks who point towards unity and justice and peace. Taking a lot of heart from that and using that to guide the way we cast moral imagination for ourselves today is key. We'll all still probably have those fear responses, but to moving through it away from that protectionism, to imagining a world where we're able to transcend that fear, to transcend that division and us versus them mentality, to actually bring about that future that we want to see that might feel incredibly far away, whatever the division of the day looks like.
I've been thinking a lot about recently what it takes to become a people of hope in a time of such deep despair. And even thinking about our generation, I mean, we are living in a moment and have grown up in a time in which catastrophe is all around us. And it's really the only story that we are being told. You have climate catastrophe, you have, global war, you have, refugee crises in the Middle East and in Africa. I mean, right now there are tens of thousands of people being displaced in Sudan, right? And none of us are even paying attention to it because there's so much conscripting our attention. And I think what you're naming is that, we've really, there's a dearth for stories that are able to cast that imagination for us of a world that is whole, of a world where each of us are whole in it. And I think when we think about this work of becoming a people of hope, it takes lament, it takes deconstruction, recognizing what is broken and recognizing the death around us that we need to grieve, and that we are very good at doing as a society. I mean, my generation is deconstructing left and right. We know how to do this work, and it's important work ultimately, right? To be able to peel back the layers and understand the roots of why we are experiencing the suffering that we are. But we have to move into imagination. We have to be able to build something new together and imagine something beyond the borders of the possible that we see around us today. And we have to do the work of getting active.
Well, on that, I would love a little more texture. I mean, you all are singing my song here around moral imagination. That's really what comment is all about, trying to paint and provide, sometimes through conceptual work on the page, sometimes through narrative work on the page and through podcasts, sometimes, and probably most powerfully, through being champions of the difficult room in real time. So having unlikely bands of people gathered around meals and substantive questions that draw upon personal wounds and large-scale cultural observations, some of which clash with one another, and the sort of relational encounter and exchange between strangers and friends that ultimately leads, hopefully, to, if not softened hearts, at least a taste of curiosity for something beyond the bounds of one's own hermetically sealed despair. I think it's a really important work, and it's actually hard to find kindred spirited organizations doing it. Can you describe the various ingredients you put on the palette of what you're calling like the cultivation of a moral imagination? How do you do that, especially for an atmosphere today that has a low-grade nihilism simmering?
It's a great question, Anne, and we don't have time to get into all 12 of our principles and practices of peacemaking today. But I want to touch on our first two practices because I think that is what lays the foundation for all of these other ones to be possible. And those are listening to understand and holding competing perspectives in tension. And why I think these two are so powerful is, one, it forces us to see the world the way it is in its complexity, not the way we want it to be. The good, the bad, the ugly, the things that are thriving, the things that need to be transformed. But it also reminds us that all of us only have a limited perspective on our shared reality, and that without the stories, narratives, experiences of others who, right, might come from very different backgrounds or communities, without understanding those, we are unable to do the work of peace and justice and reconciliation and wholeness. And so that's the invitation, right? We make to trip participants when they sit in the living rooms of folks who come from diametrically opposed backgrounds with very different political perspectives or lived realities, right? We ask them to listen to understand that person's story, the deep story about why they care about what they care about, what has shaped and formed their worldview, not just what they think and believe, but why. And then hold it in tension, not just with their own, but with all of the other ones they hear. So it's not about listening to debate, to disagree, to disengage. It's about listening to understand, and then taking that and putting it in tension with all of these other perspectives to see the biggest picture possible, both of the challenges that face us collectively, but then also so we can work to identify and address all of those different pieces of the puzzle of violence so we can bring about the most peace. And what I really love about these two practices is that they challenge everyone universally. None of us come to that table thinking, I've got it all figured out. And both of these require both curiosity and humility. And I think that if there are any two values we can cultivate, those are two for all of us that let us approach these conversations and these rooms and places of engagement in a way that is open to both transforming other people, but also being transformed ourselves. This is what lets our team at Telos thrive. We come together across lines of difference. We're able to do the work we do because we bring different perspectives to the team. We listen to each other, we hold those in tension, and are able, I think, to do the work we do in the world because we put these into practice to address the needs of the different communities and perspectives we represent. And when folks come on our trips or engage our programming and are equipped to do this, that's where, right, the real magic or transformation happens that lets them lean into that moral imagination, not just for themselves, but also for their neighbors or their so-called enemies.
I think that's so powerful, Sarah. I mean, I'm thinking about this call to an imagination and mutuality, which is that, as Fannie Lou Hamer said, none of us are free until all of us are free. And this distinction between the experience of seeing injustice, witnessing despair or violence, and saying, oh, that's wrong. And then the move into an experience of it that says, that's me. I'm on the other side of that violence, or I'm being harmed by this, or someone in my community is experiencing the harm of a situation, and how that kind of pull into I'm a part of this, and my flourishing is tied up in the ending of this violence or the transformation of this conflict. That is necessary as part of this work in some way. And I will never forget when I first started at Telos. It was in 2019, soon after I got to go on my first Telos trip to Israel and Palestine, and my parents got to come, which is a really lovely experience. And my parents and I, we love each other. We have great conversations and so much fun and together, but we don't talk politics. I was, had just graduated undergrad a couple of years earlier, and as a really idealistic college student, came in hot every time I was on a break with my parents and ready to debate all of the new things I was learning. But I really wanted them to come on this trip with me because I was beginning to work for this organization I believed really strongly, and my own personal experiences, frankly, having a Palestinian roommate freshman year in college had really transformed me. And I will never forget, before I left for this trip, and they are comfortable with me sharing this story, but I was talking with them about it. We were preparing for this experience. They were really excited to go to the Holy Land, and I kept calling it Israel and Palestine. And my dad kind of stopped and he said, "Why do you keep calling it Palestine? There's no such thing as a Palestinian." And I was really struck by that comment, and I was like, "Okay, I can hold it together." I understand, where he's coming from, and perhaps what he's trying to say here as a means of honoring the people in the region who he understands to be there. But I had met Palestinians in college. One of them was one of my best friends, and felt really wounded by that experience. But being on the ground in the region, walking from Jerusalem and around the old city to Bethlehem and the West Bank, to visiting Jericho, right? This famous path even we read about often in the scriptures, and meeting with folks from across the spectrum, but especially Palestinian Christians who my dad, for the first time was encountering. These people who, and you should know, my dad is Arab American. His family's from Syria, who looked like him, who had shared history in some ways, who worshiped the same God. It was such a powerful, transformative experience for him, because in a new way he began to see someone like me across from him. And ultimately, at the end, this final meeting that we had on this trip with parents. I mean, he was a parent of 5 kids. He knows what it's like to be a parent of these parents, both Palestinian and Israeli, who had all lost someone to the violence related to a conflict. An Israeli mother whose son was killed by a Palestinian sniper, called in from the reserves. He was a peace activist, murdered, and yet who chose to reject what she called her just right to revenge in the effort of building a world free of this cycle and this spiral of violence. And this Palestinian mother who sat beside her, who shared the story of her son inhaling tear gas as they lived near a refugee camp in Bethlehem. That's the most tear gassed place in the world. And imagine raising a child in that environment, whose son inhaled this tear gas, who was stopped at a checkpoint and not allowed to get to the hospital, which caused her baby boy to suffocate and die. And yet who chose, despite many years of intense hatred towards the Israelis across the checkpoint, across the separation wall from her, she chose to believe in the power of reconciliation and the power of nonviolence to pursue a world in which her baby boy could have lived. And her friend, this Israeli mother, her son didn't have to be, or wasn't killed. And that encounter with these parents really opened him up to say, I believe in that world too, in which no more parent has to grieve. And so it's this invitation to seeing ourselves alongside as the folks that we encounter, the folks who are suffering. One other thing I want to point out too is this difference between optimism and pessimism and hope and despair. Because I think this is a really important invitation for us. I think a lot of folks get caught in this sense that they have to see the evidence of the world and the way it's moving towards, destruction, and say, I have to find some way in which this is actually good, or way, I have to find a way to spin it in a good light. And that's an exhausting strategy for coping. And frankly, I actually don't think that optimism is what the people of God necessarily are even called to. It's this choice, or the spectrum between optimism and pessimism is really a reflection of what's our take on the evidence. Where do we see things going? And in many ways, the pessimists have the evidence on their side, particularly in this moment. But this choice between hope and despair, and I emphasize that this choice is really where we think the invitation for Peacemakers is, because it's not a reflection of how we feel about the events or what we think is going to happen. It's how we choose to respond to them. And hope being this choice to participate in building this new world that may not look possible today, but may be possible tomorrow. Whereas despair is this recognition, or this choice to say there's nothing I can do about a world that's getting worse and worse each day, and I throw up my hands. And for us as peacemakers, for those of us who come from the Christian tradition, we are to be a people of hope. We have this opportunity and this invitation to take on courage and to live into the world that we believe is coming.
Do you think it is possible for an institution or an organization to serve effectively as an agile bridge builder, peacemaker, or can only individuals do that?
It's a challenging question that I think all of us who belong to different institutions that we love, but also would critique, have to navigate. And I think, to me, coming at it from like a realist angle, the lens that I think has been helpful for me is to recognize the limits to which I can expect the institution to change, and to understand why, to then work within them to the extent that I think is possible. But then personally, right, this is my personal choice, to spend more of my time and energy not always trying to change that institution that I don't think will change because of external factors, but finding other ways to engage that are rooted in that, right? That are not ignoring that are not entirely outside of it, but say, like, there's a limit of what I can do and transform here. We have limited energy and the ability to try and transform and work, and really strategically choosing how and when to use that, where to lean in and where to serve our energy. Sometimes for me, the most effective way to respond when I'm frustrated by an institution's slowness or unwillingness I'm going to say, take a lead or cast moral imagination, is to then step outside of it and do that, not in counterpoint to it, but to build the world I want to see, right? Form new institutions, form new communities that aren't in conflict or even in competition, but that complement and supplement the work that is able to be done. I think for me personally, right, I come from an academic background. I have a deep love for academia, and I think there will always be a limit to which academic institutions are able to be leaders in public witness. And that's where, individuals or outside movements throughout the history of the civil rights movement, right, throughout any protest movement, folks who come out of those institutions are important bearers of witness and key leaders. And also, I think that they themselves have had to recognize the degree to which they're constrained by the institutions they belong to. And at the end of the day, from my perspective, it has to be a personal choice how much energy any of us want to expend on transforming those that we belong to versus deciding to move beyond them and create something new and imaginative.
I appreciate that. I want to add a layer to that because I don't disagree with you, but I have been wrestling, and this has actually been true most of my vocation. I have written a book about institutions. I want to still really believe in them. I think they're necessary for enduring change, and at their healthiest, they can hold us as isolated individuals in a way that is actually its own channel of grace for us in our lives. I think especially as so many other non-work related institutions have eroded for many of us, there's something about if you serve a place of a certain kind of mission and telos, and there's healthy leadership and so on, something about it can also tutor you. It's not just you who are trying to tutor the organization or use it for your own ends. But yeah, it's an interesting balance. If you are called to be a bridge builder, you have some of those gifts because you're a translator, because you've been exposed to many different worlds and many different pains that are very genuinely felt around any sort of conflict. I personally am someone who has been very shaped by certain kinds of work and experiences and accompaniment in Latin America in quite impoverished communities, a bit more of a Henry Nouwen flavor. I have this deep from the margins bias when it comes to what I find to be the most paradoxical, beautiful truths about life and eternity. However, I also am an appreciator of moral realism, that a certain kind of heavyweight institution that, thinks seriously about the nature of a just war and thinks seriously about certain kinds of disciplines and isn't just peaceniks and bohemian. And there's a tension that I feel within myself between wanting to, on the one hand, there's the prophetic edge that typically goes out towards often the more sort of movement visionaries, more grassroots, and then also feeling humble before a hard-earned, mature, seasoned wisdom about navigating a fallen world that certain kinds of institutions actually are often more durably equipped to handle than an individual. So these are very interesting times to try to not erase either, but somehow have them collaborate.
I think that that's where one of the things I appreciate so much as an employee at Telos is that there's an expansiveness on our team to have conversations privately that aren't always held publicly. And I think the healthiest of institutions are spaces where that is possible, where behind closed doors within the institutions, there is room for challenge and growth and self-interrogation and reflection and pushing the limit of what we assume is possible within that institution, strength or stalwartness. And I can fully respect, right, that sometimes what is said publicly or public facing decisions and communications, how institutions show up in the world, looks a little bit different. And I think for me, that would be my personal litmus test of where I fall kind of on that is if there's an ability to keep pushing the boundaries of what we believe is possible internally, will we maintain stability and effectiveness publicly, that feels different. I'm someone who comes more from the outside in. We can't bring about a world that we don't imagine. And I'm not trying to say that that's not what you were suggesting, but unless we can imagine new ways that these institutions themselves can engage, we're never going to see them. And I think that process of continual reflection and assessing what's possible and how institutions can, in a healthy way, adapt and change and respond to the changing world around us, that's really important to maintain that, importance and strength and historical legacy of stalwart institutions that absolutely do have a role to play.
I think along with that too, I mean, just noting my own experience, I came into Telos. It's been about 5 years now. I was, just not long after graduating from undergrad, and funny enough, and I share this openly with our team, but I wasn't sure if Telos would be the right fit for me, even when first starting. And over the course of 5 years, I've seen myself be formed and transformed in countless ways by this organization, which is itself, its own organism as this thing that emerges from a collection of people, but it's also this set of relationships with individuals and people who have transformed me, whose stories, whose wisdom, like Sarah and all that she brings to our team, and like everyone else who's come through our doors since I've started, have really transformed me. And I've found a kind of belonging that I didn't imagine could be possible here before. And I think that there's something there for institutions, for our world right now, this kind of space for belonging, especially those of us, and this issue in particular, want to hold room for nuance and for this both imagination, but also this realism of how do we make strategic choices in the world that have costs, right? We can't be everything to everyone. And I think that's, for us, at least in our work, one of our values is holding, creating as big a tent as possible. And ultimately, there are some people who aren't going to fit in that tent, even so, and who don't want to see a big tent. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, I think our world is stronger by having folks on the poles to push and to pull, right, and to shape us all into being more authentic versions of ourselves and living out truly what our values are. And that we need this kind of environment of lots of different organisms working together in order to push us towards a world that is more whole and more true. But I think it's a real tension that we especially are facing right now. We don't believe that anyone is disposable. That's a core value of ours. And sometimes people aren't going to want to buy in, and we have to leave them on the side of the road if we want to continue doing our work. And as someone who really wants to push back against any kind of abandonment that I see around me, it's a real tension. But I think it's one that we have to wrestle with for sure. As you're saying, that institutions, organizations have to make those kinds of strategic decisions if we're going to live out our values.
And the one thing I'd add, David, just to clarify what you said, when we say leave them on the side of the road, it doesn't mean that we stop working for their liberation or their flourishing. We're continuing to fight for a just and peaceful future for even those who disagree with us and how we engage in our methodology. So there might not be room under the tent within an institution, but that doesn't mean that then the institution is inherently against them or sees them as less worthy and valuable. Just because folks don't agree with you doesn't mean that you're let off the hook for working for their flourishing.
This goes back to something I was saying earlier about the difficulty of, quote, scaling a beautiful work like Telos's. And I say it's difficult just because I think true transformation is not easily scaled. It doesn't go fast. It's necessarily, there's no shortcuts. And I love slow work. I think that doesn't mean it isn't really hard and there aren't fast-paced days when you're doing it. But I think the actual, like, trying to create moral imagination for people to steep within and be gradually changed by is some of the most worthy work out there. Not the most worthy work out there, but it's just a very worthy enterprise. And yet we live in such an impatient moment. I mean, partly because of, especially around this current Middle East conflict, the emotions are so deep. Most people at somewhere along the way, either through relationship or personal history, have in this country have some relation to a side in the conflict. And all of this is baked within a broader, fraught election year, and I think just technological age where we jump to conclusions, we have no patience for nuance, we don't even actually have many of the right sort of communal conditions for like really listening kinds of conversations. So that context being what it is, how do you find that the sort of slower nature of Telos's ultimate like magic, and what it is trying to impart to all those who come across its path? Do you find that there is a patience and like appreciation for like the nature of in which you all approach time as you think about forming moral imagination and sort of transforming souls and postures and action, or in the binary impatient mode of our moment, you're as caricatured as anybody?
I, I, I think it's a really interesting question. Um, there are, some constraints for us in the past couple of years that have made travel quite difficult. As you might imagine, of course, there was the pandemic, and then the past 8 months, we have not been traveling to the region. And so we've had to do, in some ways, a kind of strategic reset of what does it look like to help do this formation in a context in which the very environment in which that happened is no longer accessible to us. And it's one I think that we're trying to, rethink and re-strategize continuously. And it has looked like building out this framework that we call the principles and practices of peacemaking as this kind of like textural thing that you can hold in your hands to help build this. But again, really learning how to embody them, how to have them shape the language that we use and be the lens with which we engage in our community. It, again, as you're saying, it takes time, it takes long work. And I think that we are coming up against the forces around us that tell us that is not work that's worth investing in because the payoff is down the road, further than what we can see. But I think for us, it's been, a tension that we've navigated with a lot of, I think, perhaps for lack of a better term, just hope and pushing people towards this larger vision. I mean, our name Telos is this, as you alluded to or used earlier, and I'm sure your listeners are aware of this idea of this end goal, this vision that's beyond what we can see, where we're directing all of our attention and energies. And I think of it as like this dot at the end of a road that goes off into the distance, that like classic image. And for us, it's that continual kind of squeaky wheel of we have to name that Telos. We're going to name that mutual flourishing end in which all people have dignity, security, and freedom in the region and in our own communities. And it's slow work, and sometimes we don't ever see the results of it either. And I think that's a particular tension too of this kind of long transformation. We often don't see the fruits that we plant in our work, but it's work that we believe is necessary, whether we see that or not.
The piece I want to add in is just yet another tension at Telos, right? I feel like we invite people to sit in that discomfort and tension more than we give those answers. But I think a tension too is that tyranny between people are experiencing violence today that must be stopped today. And that has to coexist with the fact that transformation does take a longer time. And so I think I'll just speak personally, navigating what that looks like, feeling a deep responsibility to our Israelis and Palestinian partners who are experiencing direct violence, structural violence today in ways that, threaten life and liberty. Figuring out how to advocate to end that, to stop that, has to exist with that tension of that culture work, that perspective shift takes time. And I think that's true for our partners in the South too, right? That there are folks who experience violence in very direct ways that has to be stopped and transformed before we get everyone on board. And so I think that that's part of this tension and work too, is there has to be a belief in growth, right? That change is possible for individuals, for institutions, for cultures, for systems and structures. And that takes time. And also that doesn't let us off the hook to advocate to the best of our ability to stop the immediacy of violence that enables us to move beyond, right, people dying. In Israel, Palestine right now, right, one of our calls to action, or multiple of our calls to action, are to demand a ceasefire, to demand the release of all hostages and the access of humanitarian aid. Because we know that the violence that has led us to this moment is what got us here, but not how we get out of here. And we demand that, right? We ask our network to demand that at the same time as we leave room for the deeper internal transformation of holding these perspectives in tension and understanding the deeper stories. And I think for all of us on any issue, figuring out how those coexist, how taking action today to stop violence that is happening now exists in tension with that deeper personal and collective transformation that casts the moral imagination. I think that has always been a challenge in any of these movements and will continue being a challenge. But is one, again, that we have to navigate with that humility and curiosity around where we can act in ways that, live out love for our neighbors, while also recognizing that we have personal room to grow on a lot of these issues ourselves.
I think that's really beautiful, Sarah. And I'm reminded of a poem, of a quote that if it's okay, I might share it, that I think speaks to this. It's by Rubem Alves. It's called "What is Hope?" He says, and this is just a portion of it. So let us plant dates, even though we who plant them will never eat them. We must live by the love of what we will never see. That is the secret discipline. Such disciplined hope is what has given prophets, revolutionaries, and saints the courage to die for the future they envisage. They make their own bodies the seed of their highest hopes. I think it's a beautiful quote.
That is beautiful. I might just have to end the whole conversation there. I'm just going to ask one more question. I would love to hear either or both of you reflect on how you understand the relationship between forgiveness and peacemaking. Are they necessarily intertwined, or are they utterly different animals?
Such an important question. And I think where I want to start is in our practice of justice, the belief that peace and justice are intertwined. And because I want to make sure I get the wording right, I'm going to go ahead and read it. And we believe that working for peace without justice is unserious, empty, and dangerous. But working for justice without concern for healing and reconciliation can degenerate into violence and revenge. True justice is expansive and contested, yet true justice enables the possibility of mutual flourishing. And I think the reason I wanted to bring that in and put this back on Telos to frame instead of going off on, my own personal soapbox is so often, right, that idea of peace and justice and reconciliation. For those of us who are not directly affected by violence, it's very easy to sit here and prescribe what that looks like. But I think for all of us, that call to work for peace and justice simultaneously invites us into that work of transformation and reducing the impact of violence on ourselves and others, while opening that possibility for building the beloved community, working for what we call mutual flourishing, working for that collective liberation.
I'm reminded of a story from a documentary film that followed the Israeli mother I mentioned earlier. Her name is Robbie Damlin. The film is called One Day After Peace. And it's her exploration of this question. What is forgiveness? What does it have to do with peace? Are they necessarily conjoined, or do they exist separately? And this is a woman whose son was brutally murdered, who was killed by a Palestinian sniper. Now, Robbie is originally South African before she moved to Israel. And she returned to South Africa following the end of the fall of apartheid to explore this question. I think probably more than a decade or two after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened there. It tells the story of sitting with this man and this woman. One, this South African mother, who is an Afrikaner. Her daughter was a white woman who went to a nightclub and was killed in a bombing by the ANC, or orchestrated originally by the ANC. And she is sitting across from the table with the man who orchestrated this bombing. And in the course of this conversation, is telling the story of how she, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in this very public hearing, forgave this man who orchestrated her daughter's death, and the courage that that took. But it wasn't necessarily that forgiveness that struck Robbie. It was the man's response. And he said, "Your forgiveness released me from the prison of my own inhumanity." And that line has stayed with me since I heard that in this film. This multiple layers separation. But I think this idea of forgiveness enabling the work of collective liberation, as Sarah mentioned, is so essential. Because when we participate in violence, we are ultimately degrading our own humanness. I don't believe that we were made to degrade the image of God in another person. I think that disconnects us from something true within us. And nonviolence and forgiveness being this opportunity to say, I won't continue this act of violence. I won't perpetuate this cycle of degradation. And so in so doing, I release you from the violence that I could have done against you and the degradation of your own humanity. I think this collective liberation, that is this world that we're trying to imagine together, which is driven by reconciliation and all of us learning or being able to live out our full humanity, is really necessary for peace. It's part of this mutual flourishing, that there's no world where any of us can be free when not all of us are free, right? So I come back to that story often, and you can watch the rest of the film and see how Robbie ends in her understanding of forgiveness. I'd really recommend it. But I think it's absolutely intertwined. I don't think we get to a world of peace until reconciliation is part of it. And I think the historical record shows that too, in these places of violence in which peace agreements have occurred, in which there's been kind of legal frameworks to end violence. It can often just look like an absence of tension rather than the presence of justice or true communal reconciliation.
There's so much more we could talk about and reflect on, but I just want to thank you for joining this with me today. And like I said earlier, the witness, I think, of your long-suffering hope and your commitment to trying to create a moral imagination for our world and for others, and hopefully boomeranging back a little bit to sustain your own hope, which is very needed, which has to be like oxygen for the work you do. So just thank you both so much. I'm very honored to get to.
Thanks so much, Hannah. It's been good.
Our pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Whole Person Revolution, a podcast of Comment Magazine. We exist to foster imagination for a thriving society, and our product line is blossoming. We publish a beautiful print magazine 4 times a year that tries to peer into timely societal questions lurking just behind our everyday consciousness. We publish an additional slew of online essays and personality-flavored columns like Matthew Milliner's Material Mysticism, Greg Thompson's The Welcome Table, and Alan Jacobs' Snakes and Ladders. And we are building an exciting new podcast network with The Whole Person Revolution, joined by Zealots at the Gate, a conversation about religion and democracy with Shadi Hamid and Matthew Koenig. All of this is animated by a rich Christian humanist tradition that we feel well poised to pick up and apply to our times. Please consider participating in this 2,000-year-old conversation and the community rallying around it now. You can write, you can read, you can host a comment supper in your neighborhood or attend one of our webinars with an author and your fellow readers. We want to equip you to be an agent of renewal in our time, and we need to learn from you. Write to us at podcasts@comment.org and expect a substantive exchange. We're honored to have you within our orbit and to pilgrim together toward wholeness in a world splintering against it. The Whole Person Revolution is hosted by Comment edited by Becca Bruder, produced and with original music by Allie Crummy, audience strategy by Matt Crummy. I'm Ann Snyder, and I'll see you in a month.